never seems to cease that the world is worried about global warming, about man-made global warming. Or if not the world, at least the Democratic Party here in the United States and certain more left-leaning people around the world in political leadership here and there. One of the recent issues arising on that is that the Biden administration has called for the United States to reach net zero, that is, emissions of carbon dioxide, by the year 2050. And the International Energy Agency has issued a major paper that purports to put together a roadmap to achieve that. The fact is that that paper, though it sets forth a roadmap, actually contains all of the evidence to indicate that achieving net zero by 2050 is a losing proposition. Not just a minor losing proposition, but a really serious, major losing proposition. Tonight on From the Stacks, we have Dr. David Kreutzer, who is the senior economist for the Institute for Energy Research, former top economist with the Heritage Foundation, and a good friend of mine, to discuss this report and to just look at a few of the indicators in it that net zero by 2050 is not a great idea, not exactly something that you and I would like to see happen to ourselves, but more importantly, something that we don't want to see happen to the poor here in America and the even poorer around the world. So in a moment, we'll bring David on to discuss this. I'd just like to welcome you to the show tonight and tell you a little bit about the Cornwall Alliance for the Stewardship of Creation. We are a network of just under 70 evangelical scholars. Roughly a third are natural scientists, including some of the world's top climate scientists, as well as many profound economists. Roughly a third are climate scientists, as well as scientists of other specialization. Roughly a third are economists with specialization, particularly in environment and development. And then roughly a third are theologians, philosophers, and religious leaders dedicated to educating the public and policymakers on economic development for the very poor around the world through free markets, through private property rights, entrepreneurship, free trade, limited government, and the rule of law, and through access to abundant, affordable, reliable energy. And second, educating about biblical earth stewardship, that is, how we can enhance the fruitfulness, the beauty, and the safety of the earth to the glory of God and the benefit of our neighbors. And third, talking about or educating about the gospel of Jesus, the good news that sinners like me can be reconciled to the holy God by grace alone, through faith alone, in Jesus Christ alone. These are the main focuses of the work of the Cornwall Alliance, and I would encourage you to come to the Cornwall Alliance for more about those. Every month, we offer a special product as our way of saying thanks when someone makes a 100% tax-deductible donation of literally any size. This month, our offer is the booklet, The Climate Blame Game. Are we really causing extreme weather? By the weather statistician and meteorologist, William M. Matt Briggs. This is a wonderful study that shows exactly why we should not accept the claim that human-induced global warming is causing more frequent or more intense severe weather events. To request your copy, all you need to do is go to cornwallalliance.org, click on the donate button, and no matter how little you donate, when you ask for it, we'll be glad to send you a copy of this. As you fill out the donation form, when you come to the comments field, simply put in promo code 21-07, that's promo code 21-07, or the title, The Climate Blame Game, or both, and we'll be glad to send it to you free of charge. So we hope that you will take advantage of this, and meanwhile, thanks for tuning in this evening. Now let me introduce David Kreutzer. He is the senior economist at the Institute for Energy Research, uh, and he actually shows that the Biden-Harris plan for net zero by 2050 is, quote, a complete loser for Americans. This week, he joins us to critique the plan put out by the International Energy Agency. David, thanks very much for joining us.
Well, thanks very much for having me on, and also thanks for the good work you and the Cornwall Alliance do. Really, it's important.
Thank you. Well, we're going to just jump right straight into this, where we've taken a number of different graphs from the International Energy Agency's big report on this. And this is going to be a rather whirlwind tour through this report, the role of critical minerals in clean energy transitions. Now, there are all sorts of different bases on which we might criticize the demand that we make a very rapid transition from fossil fuels, which now provide somewhere around 85% of all the energy used in the world, to wind, solar, and other so-called renewable energy sources. All kinds of different reasons we might criticize that. But our focus tonight is particularly on the requirements for minerals for providing the technologies, the tools, the wind turbines, the solar panels, solar arrays, the electrical transmission lines from the turbines and solar arrays, which are far more spread out than, say, coal or gas or oil-fired generating plants, let alone nuclear. And so consequently, the prices, the costs of generating electricity from these renewables tend to run much higher than the costs for fossil fuels. But we're going to focus primarily on the issue of, okay, how much of the various different minerals required to do these is actually required. And that's a very serious issue. So David, do you want to just give us a few brief introductory remarks on this?
Sure. I think first of all, it's really important to understand that this net zero by 2050 is a wholly arbitrary target. There's no economics or science that says that that's the year we need to do it or should do it, or even that we should do it at all. So just like the 2-degree limit on temperature increases or 1.5 degrees, those, if you can even find the scientists themselves who put these forward saying, well, they're arbitrary. They were nice numbers that were easy to politically sell. So we need to start off saying, first of all, this target is totally arbitrary. Okay. Now we can look at what the costs are. And the costs can be from all sorts of things, the transmission, the land use, and so on. But as we're saying tonight, we'll just look at the minerals. And the proponents of switching to solar and wind power keep bragging about how the costs have been going down. The costs have been going down. Well, the cost of a solar panel have been going down, and the cost, of some sense, of wind generation, has been going down. But it's difficult to measure the impact of the unreliability of these two sources.
Right.
And if we start looking at the demands on the inputs for these things that this report shows, that's pretty much going to put a floor on any cost reductions, and probably going to raise that floor up and jack up the prices of these of the minerals that you need for electric cars, for the turbines, and for the solar panels.
Yeah, I'm going to play devil's advocate for just a minute, though, with you, David, regarding the arbitrary or capricious nature of the deadline date and the temperature max that we want to stay within, and so on. Isn't it the case, really, that anytime policy decides we're going to achieve such and such by such and such a date, we're going to this is our goal, this is the deadline by which we want to achieve it, isn't that always to some extent arbitrary, because we could always shift it forward 5 years, back 5 years. We could shift the goal up, a couple $1 billion or down a couple $1 billion.
It is arbitrary. And as an economist, I would like to think that if you're going to talk about, how fast we should draw down some particular source of energy and how fast we should ramp up some other source of energy, that it would be based on costs and benefits. And this is absolutely not based on costs and benefits. It's they say things like, well, if we do it by 2050, scientists tell us that's always you be aware that should set off your meter. Scientists tell us that it will reduce the most damaging parts of climate change. Well, the model that they use, that would be true for any target, any time horizon. You could say, we need to get off of carbon by 2300. Scientists say that will, get rid of the most damaging, or we need to do it by, next August. That would be, reduce the most damaging. It's even that, those are sort of nonsense statements because of the way they derive their models, that the most damaging stuff is always at the end. So the stuff you get rid of first, in their way of thinking, is the most damaging. So it doesn't matter where you set, this horizon. Okay.
Good point.
But the other thing is, they have, as you know, they have created this hysteria, this notion in the media and in the public perception that there's an existential threat from climate change, which just simply doesn't bear out even in the IPCC models, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. Nordhaus, the guy who won the Nobel Prize for doing the economics of climate change and climate adaptation. It's if you look at his model, it's almost embarrassing. He didn't repeat the graph that he drew in 2013, showing the difference between the optimal transition and business as usual in terms of GDP per capita or consumption per capita worldwide. If you look at the year 2100, there's the pencil width between the optimal and doing nothing. And if you think about the damage that could be done in terms of government not actually doing it optimally, all right, I think we would end up worse than doing nothing. But there's in no case was it an existential threat.
Yeah, and I think to go back to one point that you just made, we're talking about trade-offs here. We're talking about costs and benefits. And I think back, for example, to Bjorn Lomborg's calculation that full implementation of the Paris Climate Agreement by all the signatories to it from now to the end of the century would cost anywhere between $1 and $2 trillion per year from 2030 onward. And the result would be a reduction in global average temperature of 0.3 of a degree Fahrenheit. Well, what that figures out to is we're asking people to pay $23.3 to $46.6 trillion per 0.1 of a degree Fahrenheit in temperature reduction in the year 2100 in order supposedly to benefit the people who are living in that year. And yet, as Lomborg also points out, this would only delay the rise by those additional 0.3 of a degree Fahrenheit by about 5 years. And meanwhile, the $70 to $140 trillion spent to do that can't be spent on things like making sure that everybody in the world has purified drinking water, sewage sanitation, safe food, safe transportation, electricity, to the
affordable energy,
affordable energy, all of these different things. We can't spend what we spend on X on Y. We cannot spend the same money twice. And so what we need to do is to think in terms of the costs and the benefits. And that's a part of it. What we're going to do tonight is to look at a part of the costs of this forced rapid transition from fossil fuels to wind and solar as the two primary renewable energy sources. And we're going to look primarily at, what are the minerals that we need to mine and refine and then work into turbines and and solar arrays and batteries and all the other things necessary to make this stuff work. So I want us to just start by looking at a graph that the International Energy Agency provided called Rapid Deployment of Clean Energy Technologies as Part of Energy Transitions implies a significant increase in demand for minerals. David, can you just kind of explain that briefly for our viewers?
Now, to be fair, this doesn't include steel or iron or aluminum. So we're looking at the minerals you need for the clean energy technologies. And for the electric car, you can see up there, it'd be 200 kilograms per vehicle. So, a little over 400 pounds, which actually seems low to me because the batteries are pretty heavy compared to those same minerals. And those are the ones we're mostly worried about. We're not worried about supply of steel or aluminum. Those are fairly abundant, and we have supply chains that are very robust there. For the conventional car, you can see it's less than 50. I would like to look at the power generation. That's misleadingly optimistic. If you look at the kilograms of these critical minerals for offshore wind, onshore wind, solar PV, they're much larger than those critical mineral needs for natural gas, coal, or even nuclear. But what they don't say, this is kilograms per megawatt, not megawatt hour. Right. So this is the nameplate capacity, and you and I know that the capacity factor for wind and solar is pathetic compared to those other sources. Nuclear is over 90% now. Coal and natural gas can be 70, 80, 90%, though the way they're forcing wind and solar onto the grid actually reduces the efficiency of those other ones. And so their capacity factor, the potential capacity factor is much higher. For wind onshore, you'd be lucky in a really good place to have 40%. Might be higher offshore, but look at how much more expensive in terms of minerals it is there. So again, that offshore wind, onshore wind, and solar, it's actually worse because their capacity factors are so much lower than for the other sources.
Yeah, and just to explain what you meant by capacity factors.
Thank you.
When you install, for example, a wind turbine, it may have a capacity factor claim of certain number of megawatts that it can generate. But the fact is that it doesn't generate at 100% of its nameplate capacity. Its generation is determined by when the wind is blowing and how strongly the wind is blowing. And typically around the world now, with wind farms, properly called wind factories, because they're not farms, they're not growing plants or animals, wind factories around the world, the typical capacity factor is running around about 30 to 35%. But that is with wind factories placed in optimal situations. We're running out of those, and we're quickly coming to the point where if we build more wind factories, they're going to have to go in places where the wind doesn't blow as much, it doesn't blow as strongly, and it's much farther away from where the energy is actually needed. And so consequently, those capacity factors are going to be falling over time, not rising, which is the opposite of what we ought to want from a maturing technology. It ought to be getting better and better over time, not worse and worse.
Yeah, and the other thing which they have far from solving is that you're getting your 35% from the wind, but you don't get to pick when that is. You don't turn the wind up when it gets hotter and you need more power. And the same thing for the solar. I tell people that the biggest problem with solar is nighttime, and you can't get around. They're talking about developing storage technologies, but we're far from that, the ones that we need at scale. And so that chart, as bad as it is, it's actually worse than what we see there.
Yeah. Now we've talked about the fact that we're always having to live with trade-offs. So we need to keep that in mind when we talk about how wind and solar will demand more and more of various minerals. The next graph that I'd like us to look at, David, is one called the energy sector becomes a leading consumer of minerals as energy transitions accelerate. So just kind of lead the viewers through what this graph shows of what happens over time to where minerals have to go. And they have to remember, if they're going more and more to wind and solar, that means they're going to go less and less to all the other things that we now use them for.
Exactly. So that the left-hand column shows the percent of the total mineral production to energy. And so to get this, what they call accelerated transition to this arbitrary, net zero by 2050 or the sustainable development scenario, any of those, we can see. So if you look at lithium on the first, the trivial amount in 2010 went to the energy sector. Now it's about, looks like 30%. It's going to rise to, over 80, close to 90% by 2040 with a sustainable development scenario. Similar sorts of things. Cobalt was negligible amount in the energy sector in 2010. It's up looks like 15% now, and it's going to be over 60%. Now notice, this is 60% of all that's produced. This is not 60% of what we're producing today. We're going to be producing a lot more lithium, a lot more cobalt, a lot more nickel, a lot more copper. So it's taking a higher chunk of a bigger pie. And so the resources needed to get that, it's concerning. As I said off camera before we started, I'm not the kind of guy that wants to say we can't do this or we can't do that. This is impossible, because I've seen impossible things happen. I've also seen inevitable things not happen. And so when we set this target for you have to go net zero by 2050, and the International Energy Administration lays out exactly how you have to do it, there's no wiggle room there. We have to be able to get that much cobalt. We have to be able to get that much lithium. And so that's what concerns me. In DC, there's this thing that happens all the time. People come, the lobbyists, for fill in the blank, whatever the technology is. They say something like, well, this technology is going to beat all the other technologies within 5 years. And then they say, therefore, we need to mandate it. Well, if it's going to be that great of a technology, it's going to do it on its own. If electric cars are so great, and I'm actually a little bit of a fan of electric cars, I don't think you need to mandate them. They're going to be too expensive for a lot of people, all kinds of, of things. But for some people, they'll be great. But the people come in, and I had somebody 10 years ago telling me, well, in 5 years, you won't be able to get a loan for an internal combustion engine car. He was just absolutely arrogant. And within a year, his company was bankrupt, and we're still selling gasoline-powered cars. So it's this notion that, okay, maybe you do have a good technology. Let's test it. Let's see if people are willing to pay the cost to get it. That's the test. We talk about cost benefit, but here they've said, the cost is infinite benefit and, zero cost almost is how they look at any of these things. And we know that's not true. So the same thing, nickel, copper, the big one there is lithium, the rare earth, elements, they're again, that's a bigger chunk of what's likely to be a much, much larger worldwide production, because the demand is going to go up. And we'll see in a couple of slides, maybe, why that could be worrisome.
Yeah. It has to do with some matters about sources of these things.
Yes.
First, let's talk about, sort of the big picture of what's happening with mineral demand for clean energy technologies. According to the IEA, this would rise by at least 4 times by 2040 to meet climate goals, with particularly high growth for electric vehicle-related minerals. That's our next chart here.
Yeah.
Lead our viewers through this one.
Yeah. So we look. This is an aggregate amount of minerals, so metric tons, and a million tons on the first chart, and it's growing dramatically from what we already have a lot. We've increased the production of this stuff, and they break it out by the technologies. And the electric networks and the EV and battery storage the biggest demanders in that first chart. And so it's going to be a lot more than we have now, 4 to 6 times by 2050. Again, for the sole purpose of meeting this totally arbitrary net zero by 2050 target. On the second one, now this is even a little scarier here. If you look at what the vertical axis is, it says an index, where the 2020 number is 1. So all of those things are multiples of what we're producing today. So in the earlier chart, we saw the amount of the, for instance, lithium production that's going to clean energy and the various energy sources. Well, look what's happening to the growth. That's that percent was going up, but it's a percent of something that's 42 times greater in 2040 relative to today. So that's a huge diversion of lithium to these different energy and battery and electricity generating technologies. Now, it's a huge number. Can it happen? I'm not going to say they can't do it, but if you're mandating it, you have to be more than just, I think it can happen or it'll probably happen. I'd also would like to throw in here, this is worldwide, all right? So this is not just the US. There's already a huge increase and projected further increases in demand for this the solar and wind power in Europe and in China. Same thing for the EVs, the electric vehicles. So to the extent that the US is playing this game and we say we're out of it, we're still going to be suffering from the demand increases put out by the demand increases in the rest of the world. So that's that's a more worrisome thing for us. The policy that we have control over is limited, since these are charts for the worldwide. On the good side, most of the rest of the world has been perpetrating a fraud in terms of how much they're going to cut their CO2 emissions and how much they're shifting to these other technologies. So maybe there's some hope that the rest of the world is actually lying, I guess. I don't know.
This would be one of the few instances in which we'd be glad that some other guys lied, right? They're sane.
Yes, like the Paris Agreement. The U.S., without even signing it, did a better job of meeting the targets than most of the signatories to it. Exactly. But this is assuming that the rest of the world is going to hit this net zero by 2050. An expensive, hard to get target there.
Yeah. Now, one of the issues that rises again and again when we talk about wind and solar is the role that so-called rare earth metals play in their construction. Excuse me. And rare earths are not actually all that terribly rare geologically. Right. It's that they're in very small concentration, very low concentration wherever they're found. And they tend to be being mined only in certain locations around the world. And many of them are also very, very toxic. And the result is that the mining, the transporting, the refining of them leads to all kinds of serious pollution problems. But our next slide talks about how demand for rare earths quadruples in what they call the sustainable development scenarios by 2040. Although the scale of growth may vary depending on the choice of turbine technologies. So again, walk us through here.
Yeah. Okay. It's a similar story. All right. We have this huge increase in demand for resources, and as we'll see in subsequent slides, there's some problematic supply chain for a lot of these minerals. Where they're produced and where they're refined and so on. But this requires this huge increase, and it's worth, I'll give a plug to somebody that I don't really like most of his work, and that was the movie, The Planet of the Humans. That
Michael.
Thank you. I forgot the name. He pulled the curtain back on the virtue of this green technology. Now, there are lots of things that are done in developing worlds that are dirtier. We know that the environmental requirements are much lower. And that we'd hope that as they get richer, they would do what has happened everywhere else in the world when people have gotten richer. They've cleaned up their environment. But right now, it's not. And I think probably the poster child is the cobalt production in I guess it's in Niger, right?
Democratic
Congo,
Republic
excuse
of
me.
Congo.
Congo, Republic of Congo. Apologize. Yeah. And there are a lot of these quote mom and pop small producers. There's child labor problems, and the pictures that they don't have the environmental standards anything close to what we have in the U.S. So this shift, to saying to emissions-free cars. I say, well, my minivan's emissions-free at the front. The only emissions come out at the back. You can say the same thing for electric cars. They're emissions-free where they are, but they're not emissions-free in where they were produced, and they're certainly not emissions-free where the electricity is produced. And so at the very least, I'm not saying that we should shut all mineral production down. We should work with people to get better standards in those countries. But this notion that people, you can just look at the vanity license plates on electric cars. Enough to make you puke. They don't understand the environmental impact of what they're driving. And this chart, helps you see that. You can see the thing growing, but I think when we look at the supply chain stuff coming up, you'll see why that's a worry.
Yeah. If I might, I want to take just a quick detour to talk a little bit about the one comment that you made, that we hope that as these places get richer, they'll also get cleaner about how
Yes.
they mine, transport, and refine rare earth minerals and other minerals for that matter. And yeah, that's something that we can hope. And yet the actual track record of various countries differs very significantly over
Right.
whether those countries have very responsive governments that really do govern by consent of the governed, on the one hand,
Yeah.
or whether those countries have governments that are more autocratic, that really impose the will of the government on the people. The track record of socialist countries on environmental performance,
Yes.
by comparison with more capitalistic countries, is just plain wretched. The Soviet Union and China itself, the two biggest socialist communist countries in the world, have environmental track records that are just absolutely atrocious. Nothing in the Western world begins to compare with what the Soviet Union did to the Aral Sea, or what China has done to the Yangtze River with the Three Gorges Dam there, and things of that sort. And so what we need to recognize is that if we really care about a clean environment, we have to care in part about whether we want to promote the enriching of governments that are not particularly committed to a clean and healthful and beautiful environment versus governments that are committed. And that really does become relevant when we get to the supply chain issue. I do want to just quickly mention, by the way, that I wrote a short booklet called Is Capitalism Bad for the Environment? Is Capitalism Bad for the Environment? That booklet is available online through Cornwall Alliance's online store. And in fact, if someone would like to make a donation tonight or anytime in the next few weeks and ask for that booklet instead of the booklet we've been offering, the Climate Blame Game, we'd be glad to send a free copy of that. All you have to do is go to cornwallalliance.org, click on the donate button, make a donation of literally any size, and ask for Is Capitalism Bad for the Environment? And we'll be glad to send you a free copy of that. And 100% of your donation will be tax deductible. Or if you want to just buy a copy, you can always go to our online store, go to cornwallalliance.org, click on the shop button, and then you will find Is Capitalism Bad for the Environment? Okay, so
let me just say, agree with that. That is a great point, because what we see now, so many of the people who've come to DC, the ones that have the biggest megaphones, they're constantly saying, well, the problem with fill in the blank is capitalism. And they want to substitute some onerous government regulation. And the track record for their solution is horrible. And I'm glad you brought that up.
Yeah, great. Okay, so our next one is about the EV, the electric vehicle use of minerals compared with conventional vehicles. And electric vehicles, EVs, use about 6 times more minerals than do conventional vehicles. And real quick comment here. Earlier, you mentioned that one of the earlier slides you thought probably was an underestimate of the weight of various chemicals, minerals that go into EVs, because as you pointed out, the batteries are pretty heavy. The typical battery in a oh, come on, what's the very
Tesla?
popular electric vehicle? Tesla. Typical
Yeah,
Tesla battery weighs 1,000 pounds.
right,
That's an awful lot of minerals. Now, not all of that is rare earths. Not all of it is
right.
cobalt and so on,
Yeah,
but it's
yeah,
a
yeah,
massive amount. And by the way, when you stick 1,000 pounds into a vehicle, you either have to significantly reduce passenger and cargo space, or you have to significantly enlarge the vehicle. And the result is a heavier vehicle with a longer stopping range and therefore more likely accidents and therefore, too, more damage to another vehicle with which it collides because weight is
yeah,
king in collisions. So,
yeah,
but that's a different issue. Talk
yeah.
about EV use of minerals compared with conventional vehicles.
Well, okay, this is a similar story to the ones we've had before, and um, you know you can look into the different technologies that they have for the different batteries, and they require different amounts of these really more expensive minerals and metals than in compared to the conventional car, which would use, most of its mineral use would be things that we have, robust, as I said before, supply chains. And so these cars also, as well, would have to use aluminum and steel. But what we're looking at is the lithium, some of the rare earths, some of the more expensive stuff, and that's for a variety of reasons we don't produce so much here in the U.S. And that's probably something worth talking about as well. And I think when we get down to looking at these sources of these things, which I think will be more interesting, we can talk about that. Yeah. So,
Okay, right. So now I just want to point out something I think very, very significant. The very bottom line there in that graph is IC engine. That's internal combustion engine powertrain. Look at the tiny little piece of color off to the right of that.
yeah,
That's the comparative size of what it requires, the comparative weight of what it requires, compared with these other sorts of uses in EVs. Um,
yeah,
what I'm arguing is that in the end, internal combustion engines could very well be far more energy efficient, far more resource efficient than EVs.
yeah.
So,
I think that's I think that's especially true for people that, like me, retired people that don't drive that much, because the resource cost for the electric vehicles is weighted more towards the front than it is for the gasoline powered internal combustion engine vehicles. And then to the extent that, the petroleum uses more resources than producing electricity, and that benefit is not as much as people think. But it would take a lot of miles in an electric vehicle to kind of earn back even the CO2, not so much just the mineral cost, but the CO2 emissions of producing those minerals. If you don't drive very much, you're actually going to probably be producing more CO2 with an electric vehicle in total life cycle.
yeah, now a little later in our discussion here, we're going to start looking at, okay, so what would we need to do in terms of stepping up mining activities, transport activities, refining activities, and so on, in order to provide all of that? As a step toward that, it's helpful just to get some sense of the scale of change that we're going to have to achieve to
Yes.
meet the demands for minerals, for EVs, and various other aspects of the so-called renewable energy economy. So our next graph tells us what happens to mineral demand for EVs in the sustainable development scenario. It grows by nearly 30 times between 2020 and 2040. That's just over a period of 20 years. You have to produce
Right.
30 times as much as we're already producing. With demand for lithium and nickel, major components of batteries, the storage, whether for cars or storage for electricity for a grid that can't be used the moment it's generated because the wind is blowing fine, but so is the natural gas generator. So you need to store that electricity for time. So you've got a battery for that. Massive, massive batteries, by the way. The demand for lithium and nickel will grow by about 40 times over a period of just 20 years. Walk us through this one too, David.
Yeah, I would say one of the concerning things here, aside from simply the magnitude of the increase that's necessary, is where have we been getting these minerals? All right, and we'll see that later, but it's worth bringing up now because you look at this huge increase that's required, and you think about people that have tried to start mines. We have resources in the U.S., by the way, for lithium. The current estimate of the reserves is 7.5 million tons, which is about half of China's. The biggest one is, I think, Chile for lithium, and then Australia, then China, then us. We're the fourth largest, but we don't produce the fourth most amount of it or anywhere close because it is so difficult to get past the regulations that allow us to do the mining, which would be so much cleaner here than it would be in China, or probably Chile is not as bad as some of the other countries. And Australia wouldn't be that bad. But for China's production, they're not up to our standard. So these huge increases that are required are going to be coming in a lot of cases from countries that have very poor environmental records. And so the environmental damage is going to be much worse than if the U.S. were willing to participate. There was a mine in Alaska that the people that wanted to open up, it has a huge amount, a lot of it gold, I think is where they got them, but there were a huge amount of other minerals that are very useful for this energy transition if we were going to do it. But some people, as billionaires, that didn't want this to be within 100 miles of their fishing hole, that stopped it. It's ludicrous. And same thing in some other places where people have tried to start mines and it just they can't get past the opposition of the local environmentalists. So it's a bizarre thing where we're sort of pushing the development. Even if you decided you wanted to meet this ridiculous standard by 2050, which requires a 40 times increase in the next 20 years, you would hope that you would want to do that in the cleanest, most efficient and effective way, but that's not how it's playing out.
Yeah, and a part of the reason why it's not going to play out that way is precisely what we just discussed: the fact that that socialist, communist, autocratic governments that are not highly responsive to the public, tend not to care much about the environment, and consequently, they have very low thresholds for granting permission for a mine to be dug and for minerals to be refined and so on. Whereas in the United States, in Western Europe, in Great Britain, mining can take years, 15, 20 years, just to get a permit,
Right.
let alone to actually begin digging. And consequently, the more we depend on these rare earths, the more we're going to find ourselves depending on these other sorts of countries. Our next graph, I'm actually going to jump over fairly quickly. It just simply shows that the mineral demand for storage, that's for batteries, for cars and other things, for the mineral demand for storage grows by over 30 times between 2020 and 2040, with demand particularly for nickel and cobalt growing by 140 times for nickel and 70 times for cobalt. So, these are not these are not small changes that are on their way for us, and the consequences in terms of supply chains. Where do we get these things? Under what conditions do we get them? What people are poisoned by the toxic wastes generated in the mining and the refining and so on? Those are issues that are going to have to be faced. And unfortunately, too many of the people who are sitting in armchairs and promoting the policies are not really facing those. Now, the graph that we have after that has to do with mineral requirement for new power generation. That's the capacity for that has increased 50% since 2010 as low carbon technologies take a growing share of investment. So what we're looking at here is what is the mineral requirement for new power generation compared with for conventional power generation? What's happening to it over time? And that's important because we're being pushed to substitute more and more of the new power generation by wind and solar and other renewables.
Yeah, and it's worth noting that time scale here is just the past decade or so, 2010 to 2019. Yeah. Other charts we were looking at go out to 2040. So this is most of the new generation that they're pushing, except in China, has been biased towards the wind and solar with some gas, and again, this target, the last diagram, it's easy to get caught up in saying, these things are being produced in places where the environmental standards are lower, and but we're not asking the question again that we mentioned in the beginning: the why. Why are we doing this? We don't have to do this production with wind and solar. We have conventional resources that could sustain growth and electricity provision. Increases in demand, could supply it much more cheaply without using these rare earth minerals and these other metals. So that's always, we talked about it at the beginning, but I think it's worth reminding ourselves, because I get caught up. I say, well, this is, if you want to reach this goal, this is a stupid way to do it. But we say, wait a minute, why are we imposing these extraordinary costs, all right, for this rapid energy transition? It's not going to have any noticeable impact on climate change. Even if you think climate change is serious, you can use the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change's models on how much it would affect temperature, and it simply doesn't have. There's no impact even by 2100. So you have people pointing at wildfires now. They're pointing at a hurricane. Sorry, this has nothing to do with that. It's not going to change anything in the next century even. So
yeah, let me just
arbitrary targets. It's just worth remembering that when we look at these huge costs, we don't actually have to do it that way.
Yeah, let me just sandwich in here a comment that I've often heard my good friend Dr. Richard Lindzen, who is one of the world's foremost climate scientists. He's at MIT, emeritus professor of atmospheric physics at MIT, and Dick says often, what we're really being asked to do is to make a minute change in what is already a minute change in temperature. That is, we're being asked to reduce by an insignificant amount, yes, and a temperature increase that is itself insignificant. And how does he point that out? Well, he says, look, we're being asked to reduce global average temperature by, say, all right, let's be generous, 0.5 degrees Celsius from now to the end of the century, right? Meanwhile, in any given location around the Earth, temperature changes by anywhere from 20 to 40 or 50 degrees between overnight low and midday high. And it changes by anywhere from 30 to 100 degrees from winter low to summer high. And climate, global average temperature is simply irrelevant. The only temperature that's relevant is the temperature where you are. And that temperature changes by amounts that are many, many times what we're being asked to cut off of a century's worth of global warming. It's just simply absurd. And for that reason, Dick says, Look, we shouldn't even be getting into these arguments over how much warming comes from more
Right.
CO2. Even the worst case scenarios call for far less warming than all of us experience on a day-to-day basis. Well,
Right.
okay,
I
so
mean, well, no, and I
um,
think it's worth throwing in because some people say, well, it's the other things, it's the impact that it will have on weather, which the trends we've seen so far are zilch in terms of hurricanes,
yeah,
droughts, floods, tornadoes, and even wildfires. The long-term impact they're just not there. They say, well, it's going to start soon, okay, but that's not what you're
that's
telling people. You're telling people
yeah,
that if we do all this really expensive transition, if we buy these expensive cars, if we have this unreliable energy and we imagine that there's going to be this battery backup at some time in the next 20 years, then what? Really? Not much difference. Okay. So,
yeah, that's the point that Matt Briggs makes in his study, The Climate Blame Game. Again, I'll remind our viewers is what we're offering to send free of charge as our way of saying thank you when you make a donation of literally any size. Just go to cornwallalliance.org, click on the donate button, and as you fill out the donation form, when you come to the comments field, just enter promo code 21-07 or the title, The Climate Blame Game, and we'll be glad to send you a copy of this. Now we get to the supply chain issue, and this I think
that,
is
that,
something really important. This next graph is going to look a
yeah,
little intimidating at first. Maybe a little walkthrough will be helpful here, but essentially what this shows is that over time, if we make this massive transition from fossil fuels as our primary source of energy in the world, the entire world, let alone just the Western world, to wind, solar, and other renewables that are heavily dependent on rare earth minerals, we're going to have to get more and more of these minerals from the very sorts of sources that we really probably don't want to be supporting. These are bad actor governments to their own people, let alone the threat that they constitute to the Western world, to the free world. So
yeah.
tell us a bit about this one.
Yeah, this is the chart that I wanted to get to from the very beginning. So I'm glad we got here. A couple of things. I mean, you can just it's there are no numbers here other than first, second, third for the producers, refiners, and so on. But we can look that very first line. I love that one. Oil and gas. Let's look at oil production. The U.S. is kind of been going back and forth in the last few years with Saudi Arabia, but we are the world's largest producer of petroleum. All right. We're the largest producer of natural gas. And that had little to do with federal policy. Matter of fact, it was in spite of federal policy during the Obama administration.
Exactly.
The Trump administration tried to rectify it somewhat, and we're heading back again. So, those of us with gray hair that can remember the 70s and actually the several decades after that, we were at the mercy of some unsavory actors in the world for this critical resource. We in 2019, I think, for the first time, we exported more oil than we produced. We became oil independent, and it wasn't because of subsidies. Okay, it was primarily because of the smart drilling technology and hydraulic fracturing. Um, we are on track to maybe lose that, to turn the power back to these other producers that really don't necessarily have our best interests at heart, to put it mildly. Um, Look at refining of oil. We're still number one. China's number two. Consumption, we're up there, and then China and India come along. Same thing, natural gas. Here's Saudi Arabia drops out. We are the world's largest producer. All right. Again, due to smart drilling technology and hydraulic fracturing and innovation, in spite of opposition by, say, the government in New York State, which banned hydraulic fracturing, in spite of the attempt to restrict its use on federal lands. The American ingenuity and technology just pushed through, and I hope we don't stop that, but it looks like we might. Now, I'm going to drop down, we look at these clean technologies, okay, and we've talked about these are the minerals needed for the, we should be doing scare quotes a lot here for these clean technologies. We know that the source of these minerals isn't always done in a clean way. But I want to highlight one, since I see we're getting a little close here. Polysilicon. If you look down the middle column there, polysilicon is what's needed for the solar panels. All right, it's the main mineral that you need there. China is number one. It's hard to tell. It says Korea is number two and Germany is number three. But what's worth knowing is that number one is actually 80% of the world's polysilicon production. So Korea and Germany together, along with everybody else, produces 20% or less in total. So China produces 80% of polysilicon. Half of that 80%, comes from the province of Xinjiang, if I hope I said that right, which is where it looks like they have slave labor camps for the Uyghur Muslim minority that they have there. Yeah. They've been oppressed. The stories coming out, which seem pretty credible, are of horrendous human rights abuses in the territory that produces, in essence, 40% of the world's polysilicon. And so I think we have a moral question to ask here, and I'm not one that jumps on that very quickly. If we're trying to go to this more ethical, we're looking for environmental equity, it's hard to make the case that anything that uses a lot of polysilicon, which would be solar panels, meets that standard simply because of the source in China. So that's a huge concern. Hope if we're going to push it, we can produce some of the stuff elsewhere, but right now, that's sort of I would say the poster child for the problem with sourcing all of these critical minerals. They're not all that bad, but they typically, if they're produced in a developing country, they're not going to have the same environmental standards that we would have in the U.S. or Canada or Europe. And you can see some, look, if we go back to natural gas, Iran was up there. They don't have great human rights records there either, in addition to the problems with the environmental standards. So
I appreciate your keeping an eye
this
on
part is the one that concerns me the most.
Yeah, I appreciate your keeping an eye on the clock, but one of the cool things about live streams is that you don't necessarily have a hard cutoff time. Can you stay with us for perhaps another 10 minutes, David?
Yeah. No, I'd be happy to.
All right. Great. So let's move ahead. Our next graph here is on project development lead times. And this is a bit of an explanation of why it is that it's going to be so difficult to shift production of these various minerals from the mostly bad actor countries, where so many of them come from now, to the good actor countries, whether we're judging good and bad actor on environmental quality issues or on freedom issues or on geopolitical threats to peace and so on. What we're seeing is that the market tightness can appear a lot more quickly than new projects can appear. And that means we can't get away from bad actors as suppliers as quickly as we might hope that we could.
Right. These lead times make a market response in terms of supply to demand changes, very slow. And so if you have a significant increase in demand and you have a very slow increase in supply, then you're going to get these price spikes. We used to see that all the time with petroleum before, again, the smart drilling revolution and the hydraulic fracturing, and also the smart drilling includes the mapping of the resources, the seismic mapping, which became so phenomenally accurate that oil production went from this wildcatter, roll the dice, to almost a production process. And it moderated these price spikes dramatically. Now, what they've drawn out here, the time horizon, is not the matter of months like we have with hydraulic fracturing and the smart drilling, but years, an order of magnitude larger. And that's a concern. Now, I'm really surprised and happy to see that Australia only has a 4-year lead time for developing a lithium mine. That's almost a developed world record, I would think, for a short time. In the U.S., it would be several times that if we were to start a mine, and there's no indication that it's getting faster. And the environmentalists are not helping on this. They want us to have all of this technology that requires all of these minerals, but I don't know of anywhere in the world where they're trying to speed up the production of these minerals. And so that is a very concerning chart there, and it's an important one. How quickly can we respond? This says to meet these targets by 2040, we should have started the mine permitting process in 2010. To kind of get these things up, and I don't think that happened.
Yeah. Now, I think I am going to skip over one graph here on the estimated petroleum and natural gas production in selected countries.
Could I just say one thing about that? I would like to just hit it for a second.
So Jim, go ahead and read that.
Yeah. You can see here the United States. That's the blue one. We're doing great. We're the one that's producing the most, and we've increased the most. If you look at additional oil production and gas production over the past decade, it's almost all from the United States. And unfortunately, we're the administration, the Biden administration is looking to cap that and undo this wonderful improvement. So that blue line might not keep going up. That's all I want to say here, that we have people for a variety of reasons that are trying to undo the good news that we've had for the past 10 years.
Okay.
That's
all
it.
right. Thanks for
mentioning.
Yeah, thank you. Now, one of the issues that we have to deal with when we're thinking about the provision of minerals for any technologies is, where are they going to come from? Are there enough different sources that can provide them at a market competitive price for us to be reasonably secure in the expectation that we will have these over time? And that's essentially the question that is addressed by this next graph. Current production of many energy transition minerals is more geographically concentrated than that of oil or natural gas, i.e. we get oil and natural gas from a whole lot of different places, and coal too, for that matter, by the way, but the IEA doesn't like to talk about coal. But there are very few sources for these rare earth minerals, for cobalt, for nickel, for lithium, and so on. And that means that you've got a much more fragile supply chain, even if all the actors were really great. Want to walk us through this one?
Yeah, I think we can. We've talked a bit about the natural gas and the oil, and how the amazing good news we've had in the past 10 years, and how we need to be worried about that continuing. You can look at these, the percents. Yeah, they're scary. I think when you get down to cobalt, we've mentioned that the main source of the ore for cobalt is the Democratic Republic of the Congo. That's the purple line there. Then you have Russia and Australia. But what doesn't show up in that purple line is, where is it processed and who actually controls the production. China has been very active in buying up the reserves in the production of the ore of cobalt in the Democratic Republic of Congo, and they process the majority of it. So they're a huge processor of it. So they ship the ore to China. So a lot of this stuff runs through China. And I don't want to be a particular China basher, and I was less of one 5 years ago. Because I like free trade. I know trade deficits, I think, are not the boogeyman they're made out to be. But China is just an international actor, in addition to its domestic human rights problems, is scary to me in terms of the military that they're trying to project, the way that their tentacles get into all sorts of things, including the scientific establishment here in the U.S. Not to be a tinfoil hat guy, but we get Science magazine because my wife's a PhD biologist, and I keep seeing they have special editorial sections that China or various entities in China have bought just for this very important publication. So that so many of these critical minerals run through China, either the production of the ore or the processing of it. Now, and again, we can get around that. The cobalt doesn't have to be processed there, and so on, but the lag time, the supply chains you need to develop to dramatically shift the production to Europe or the US or Australia can be pretty significant. And so I think where we get these is a problem. Yeah.
And you mentioned the fact that much of this goes on in the Xinjiang province in China, where the Uyghurs are used as slave labor in many instances. I would want to point also to the simple fact that the Democratic Republic of the Congo is neither democratic nor a republic. It is a pretty hardcore autocratic socialist sort of government. And particularly problematic there is that most of the mining of cobalt and various other minerals is actually done by women and small children, usually working with very primitive tools, exposed directly to these toxic substances and digging in situations where they're very much in danger all the time. So this is, with so many people having been willing a decade ago to boycott Nike or and so on for using so-called sweatshop labor in Southeast Asia to make shoes, it is just very curious to me, let me put it that way, that so many people on the left who support this demand for a rapid transition from fossil fuels to wind and solar aren't concerned about the treatment of the workers who mine and refine these things.
Right. Poor countries have a lot of problems. The main one is they're poor. The other thing, of course, is that the government in the Democratic Republic of Congo, is autocratic. And that's typically why you see such poverty. But at the very least, we use cobalt for a lot of things, not just for electric cars and batteries. But I think it's worth pointing out the hypocrisy here of saying we want to go to, and they talk about the clean technology. All right. Well, it's not that clean. It uses the mining that's because of where it's done is actually worse than oil production here. And they talk about the dirty oil from the tar sands. They like using tar sands in Canada. Well, Canada is a first world country with the top level environmental requirements, and when they're done with the producing the sands, they return the land back to the very way close to the way it was before. And you probably, if you weren't educated on it, you wouldn't know that there'd been the oil production there. That's not the case in the Democratic Republic of Congo and so many of these other sources of these minerals. And so this aura or halo of environmental goodness that is hovers over windmills, solar panels, electric cars is totally undeserved.
Yeah. Okay, we're coming to our very last graph now. This one is on the level of concentration being similarly high for processing operations, similarly high to the place of origin of these minerals.
Yes. Okay.
With China's significant presence across the board. You mentioned that although the vast majority of cobalt, for instance, comes from DRC, it actually gets processed in China. And boy, it's real quick and easy to see who is the dominant country in processing copper, lithium, nickel, cobalt, rare earth elements around the world. In at least three of these, China is more than 50% of all the world processing. What are the dangers here?
Well, again, the dangers aren't so much from trade. I'm a free trade guy. The dangers are, will China use this power for political reasons? And it's a costly thing for China to cut off a customer, but they've done it. They did it. I can't remember what the mineral was with Japan some years back. So that would be a concern. There's also a concern with, I get no benefit from China being poor. They still are a fairly poor country on an average GDP basis. They're a huge country, so their total GDP is large. And, I don't resent them trying to grow their economy, which they did over the past 30, 40 years by becoming more capitalist, not by becoming less. But they're making a U-turn. There's a story today about the tech company stocks in China taking a nosedive in terms of stock prices because of China sort of making noises and actually going around nationalizing them. So the thing that made China the economic powerhouse, they're actually working against it to make it more of a political and military powerhouse. And I think that's a concern. Not simply that they may threaten us with with production by not selling us this stuff, because we can, over time, produce it elsewhere. We can process cobalt elsewhere. We can produce cobalt elsewhere. But the fact that that if they use this power to impose their will in so many, in either political areas or economically, let's look at the previously autonomous region of Hong Kong, or that's gone by the wayside. They're rattling their saber over Taiwan. Where everybody's pretended this game. We allow them to draw their map one way. We all know that Taiwan's not part of the People's Republic of China, but now they're saying, no, you let us draw this map. You don't allow Taiwan in the UN. You have given lip service to saying it's part of China, when everybody knows it isn't. But now they're thinking of taking it over, and who knows what limits there are to what they think used to be part of China. That's again, you can get carried away with conspiracy or coming up with horror stories, but they're doing nothing to keep us from doing that sort of thinking. They look like they want to take over critical sea lanes, expand. So I think that's why those big red bars with China on them have an extra. It's not just the concentration of the production, which if they got those big bars because they were the cheapest producers, so that's how they got it that big. But what are they going to do with it in the future? I think it is something to keep an eye on, and it's something to say, hey, look, do we really want to make ourselves more dependent on what are not exactly monopoly suppliers, but it's certainly concentrated supply sources and production sources and processing source, which is China.
Yeah. Very good, David. Thank you so much for joining us this evening. Any closing comments that you want to make?
No, just again, you mentioned Dick Linson's, and I agree with it 100%. But even if we have the climate change is going to impose some costs, it's going to be imposing them on people who are much, much richer, and they're going to have technologies to adapt to, whether it's climate change, whether it's some other thing that's happening. And we don't know what are going to be the problems of the future. We pretend because we're arrogant humans. But even if that were, the solutions we're offering are so fraught with cronyism and potential for graft, for using the crisis for some other purpose. That's a famous statement now in DC. Never let a crisis go to waste. And I'm beginning to think if there isn't one, you create it so that you can get all these policies. Just look at the $3 trillion package that they're trying to put through after the infrastructure package. I mean, it's a progressive, virtually socialist in many cases, wish list and taxes. So that's what I'm worried we have with this focus on climate. It is simply one way to allow us to lose control over big parts of our lives, and at a high cost.
just real quickly, there are an awful lot of people who, if they heard you say, oh my goodness, people 50, 80 years from now are going to be much, much wealthier than they are, and therefore much better able to deal with whatever climate problems arise, they would think, what planet is this guy from? I mean, after all, a fair number of young people believe that human beings may be extinct in another 30 to 50 years because of climate change. All kinds of people think that climate change is
Right.
just bringing devastating economic impacts on the world. Where would you send them for contrary data on this?
Well, well, they can go to the Institute for Energy Research. I've written a couple of papers, showing the one recently last month, that if you look at what's actually happening to the science, what's actually happening to the weather, the trends just aren't there. And the serious people, even on both sides of this debate, aren't talking about existential threats. They're talking about something not being as amazingly more wonderful. That instead of being 6 times richer, we're only going to be 5.7 times richer. Nobody is talking about it getting worse. So when I look at the policies people are trying to implement in Washington, that to solve this problem, I'm thinking it could be a self-fulfilling prophecy. They could come up with policies that really stunt the economic growth, and it won't be climate change that's causing people to not reach the potential. It's going to be the policies that they're passing under the costume of being a climate policy. So. Yeah. So go there. I did some stuff when I was at Heritage. There are a lot of good studies on the cost of climate policy, on the impact of climate change on the weather and so on. But I think the one I did at the Institute for Energy Research last month is my favorite. So go there.
And David, everything I've ever read by you has been just stellar, really outstanding economics. But I would also say this: we ought to send those people who think that you're from Mars on this issue to the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC,
Right.
because the IPCC, in its own assessment reports, projects that even if we did nothing to counter global warming, GDP per capita in the year 2100 would be anywhere from about 5 to 7 times what it is for the world as a whole. But for today's poor countries, it wouldn't be 5 to 7 times. It would run anywhere from 10 to 15 times what it is now.
Correct.
So in other words, the IPCC, the fount of wisdom about climate change, says that people generations from now are going to be multiple times wealthier than we are, and therefore far better able to cope with whatever comes along with climate change. Last thing I want from you, David, tell us just a bit about the Institute for Energy Research. What do you all do there? How long have you been around? Just familiarize our listeners, because I think it's a wonderful organization. I'd love to see them support it.
Yeah, the Institute for Energy Research, I think it's about 15 years old. I came on board a year and a half ago after I retired. So they ruined my retirement by getting me to come back to work for them. And I had been at Heritage doing energy and climate economics. And I worked, the conservative groups, the Institute for Energy Research, the Heritage Foundation, the Competitive Enterprise Institute, and a couple of others. We worked really closely together, had the same, affordable energy mentality, and economic growth to help people, rise out of their poverty. And so when I went back, it was because I was familiar with them. And I would say it's a small group that punches above its weight. And they've been really solid on, pro-economic freedom, pro-consumer choice, allowing innovation to provide us with affordable, abundant, and reliable energy. And I'm really happy to be working there. And it's a great website. We have other people that do even better research than I do, looking at the these topics we're talking about today, where's the battery technology going, where are the resources going to be, how much is it going to cost, and all kinds of stuff. So I'm really happy to be a part of IER. I've only been there a year and a half. It's a great group.
All right. Well, thank you very much, David Kreutzer, for being our guest this evening on From the Stacks. If you stick around after we sign off, I'd love to just chat with you real briefly if you got the moment to do that.
Absolutely.
Meanwhile, let me just point out to our viewers next week, we hope to have Vijay Jairaj, one of the most frequent writers for the Cornwall Alliance, a climate scientist living in India, educated at the University of East Anglia in England, the origin of the ClimateGate scandal, emails that showed all of the dirty tricks being done by some of the lead scientists behind the IPCC. Vijay is a good friend and can speak to us from the perspective of someone living in the developing world about the impact of American and European, other developed country policies on the poor in developing countries, not only India, but all around the developing world. So I hope that you'll join us for that next week. Meanwhile, one more reminder that we will be glad to send as our way of saying thank you when you make a gift of any size, doesn't matter how large or small, and request it, the booklet, The Climate Blame Game, or it's more like a magazine than a booklet. Are we really causing extreme weather by the meteorologist and climate statistician William Matt Briggs? To request your copy, just go to cornwallalliance.org, click on the donate button, and as you fill out the donation form, when you come to the comments field, enter promo code 21-07, that's promo code 21-07, or the title, The Climate Blame Game, and we'll be glad to send you a copy of this absolutely free. Thanks again for joining us. God bless you. Pray for the Cornwall Alliance. Pray for your elected leaders around the world. This is something that the Apostle Paul tells us in 1 Timothy chapter 2 to do, to pray for all who are in authority. Pray that God would give them wisdom, that he would give them humility, that he would give them foresight in order to make the kinds of decisions that are truly going to serve the good of the people who live in their own countries and in countries around the world. Thank you again. God bless you. Good night.